Tina is actually also a joint appointment in STS.
Okay.
So she was hired at the same time as me. She's in German studies.
Oh, so she's new too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she does feminist cultural studies of technology
Okay.
in media.
Okay.
Or did he just give us a thumbs up?
He just means that it's open. I guess that's what he means.
I don't know. 2 more minutes.
Um,
And watch this stuff.
well, we should give it at least until 3:10 on the possibility that people like you.
I've never actually been to this facility. Vast building with atrium.
They look terrible, but they don't look any worse there than they do on the little screen.
Because it's not.
Let's see if it looks okay from far.
I love the yellow right.
It seems like you have a good community here of people. Nice, diverse. Does seem that way.
Really like them. I wish that, there are tons of them.
All in one place. Because everybody's all, and you probably don't even see them unless you.
Jonathan and Jess and even that space to have them. It's not. But I mean,
One way to help that too, though, is like you can social events, like have, help people organize parties. One of the things Betty did at Florida, they developed this kind of network of dinner parties, to make sure that everybody sort of knows everybody.
Susan's wonderful.
Yeah.
She's very good.
Oh, this is so cool. So cool.
So,
It's higher.
It's higher and the cold is colder. And you don't really there's people in this public transportation regularly, so it's
Right.
I'd rather walk or drive.
It's driving.
Car and drive out.
Very slowly.
Very, very slowly. And you really get out.
Right. I don't blame you. I'd be scared. We shouldn't wait too late.
Yeah.
My guess is that they're going to need the room for something else right after us. They might not, but they might.
Is this a mic too?
Let's see. Hello. Is that working?
Does this work? Hello?
Is this working?
Yeah, but now you're mic'd.
Oh, okay. We'll just use this one.
No, because I can project.
Here. No, you want to, and then just hand it to me.
Hello? If you're not here for the talk at 3 o'clock, you might want to leave. There's a talk in this room now. But if you are here, welcome. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Susan Lindee. She's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the History and Sociology of Science department. And she's written books on the Atomic Bomb Commission and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Status of DNA as a Cultural Icon with Dorothy Nelkin and the History of Genetic Disease in American Culture, as well as many articles exploring the ways in which genes and the practices of medical genetics are given social meaning. Her current book project, the working title of which is Scientific Violence, Strategies of Experts in the 20th Century United States, is about the consequences for 20th century scientists of military support and the range of strategies that scientists have used to deal with this involvement. And she'll be talking about that book project today, and her talk is titled Evacuating Wounded Heroes, the Technical Logic of Industrialized War. So welcome.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you for inviting me here. Can everybody, is this microphone working? There are two things, when I started thinking about this paper, there are two things I realized I needed to explain. And the first is that my working definition of chaos is drawn from Carl von Clausewitz's 1832 study on war, in which he sort of makes the argument that the brilliant commander does not expect reason or rationality in war, that it's understood that war is a domain much like a natural disaster, and it's not under full rational control. And that when I use the word reason, reason for me is shorthand for technocratic rationality. And so I'm interested in this paper precisely in a rather difficult thing to track, which is the intersection of reason and chaos in modern industrialized warfare. That's the subject of the paper. Now, I'm going to look at the technical, scientific, and medical systems through which grievously wounded soldiers were moved in World Wars I and II from the battlefield to the battalion aid station to the, let me see, where's my next one? Back to the field hospital, and then if things got bad enough, back to the United States, and how bad things had to be depended on how the war was going. My favorite part of this image, which is from World War II, is the wrecked plane in the front of the picture. These systems, here's another version of the system that appeared in another book. The technologies involved in these systems were often relatively simple. So soldiers could be moved by, with the help of, here is a horse-drawn carriage. This is on the Western Front, 1916. They could be on muleback. This is, I think, in the Italian campaign in World War II. They could be moved by rope in rough terrain. So here's a soldier who's wounded being lowered down a cliff, and this is from Henry Beecher's 1949 book about his work in Italy. They could be on cargo planes. The person crouching in the middle of that picture with the book was Adela Lutz, who was one of 8 U.S. nurses killed in action in the Mediterranean theater. And so what I mean to suggest with these images is that the technologies were not necessarily so stunning. They were not necessarily sophisticated high science. But the people who were being moved through these systems were profoundly meaningful. And the system in the United States was used in propaganda stories as a sign or a signal of civilization, the evacuation system itself. So the uncivilized, the Japanese specifically, supposedly abandoned or executed their wounded soldiers. And this is a quote from Ruth Benedict's 1944 ethnography at a distance of Japan, published during the war, in which she said that military physicians in Japan executed wounded soldiers, and indeed that wounded soldiers would blow themselves up to avoid being captured by Allied troops. I queried Lee Pennington, who's a doctoral student at Columbia who's working on the history of Japanese military medicine, and he told me that in fact, as the war went on, sometimes Japanese physicians did kill wounded soldiers to prevent their being taken prisoners by the United States. So this is a system that was self-consciously linked to technological and moral superiority. It's a part of propaganda. The evacuation system is a sign that the United States is more moral. The U.S. evacuated its wounded because it was more a more advanced civilization, and the evacuation system, which was costly and inefficient, was a demonstration of efficient resource management in various ways. Medical field manuals proposed that the prompt and orderly evacuation of casualties allows combat units to preserve their mobility and promotes the morale of remaining effectives. Non-effectives were persons who were evacuated. So the purpose of evacuation it's not necessarily just for the benefit of those evacuated, it's for the benefit of the persons who have to continue to fight. It was a way of controlling the emotional state and the capacity to fight of those who were not wounded. Now, all this is by way of introducing and justifying my attention to some elements in a system that might seem to be either unimportant to our understanding of technical knowledge in 20th century war or of obvious importance to our understanding. And I want to problematize what is the evacuation system. I'm going to look at some of the practices, ideas, and objects involved in the evacuation, treatment, and scientific study of wounded soldiers. And I've got two cases. My first is Carlisle Army Barracks from 1919 to 1943. This was an effort to build a perfect litter. This is an image of a litter exercise in about 1920 at Carlisle Army Barracks, and it was a part of this research on how to build a litter that would work in many different circumstances. And my second is the story of Henry Beecher and his work on the Italian front in 1944 and 1945. He spent 9 months as a frontline experimental researcher working on shock, during which he had his pick of the most severely wounded soldiers. His goal was to understand how to treat shock. Shock was a huge problem during World War II at this stage in the war. And what I'm trying to do is to construct a sort of Venn diagram using something that's relatively high science, and that is physiology and anesthesiology, directed by a leading and prominent Harvard researcher, and litter research. That is, it's intuitively obvious, it's trivial, it's a technology that's not complicated. And I'm asking, what do these two research programs have in common, and what might their commonalities tell us about battlefield research and about the logic of industrialized warfare in the 20th century? So I have two strands of this logic which I'm going to talk about and which are present in both. First is the expectation shared by experts in both cases that technical expertise could produce knowledge that would rationalize the chaos of war. So chaos was not a fundamental property of socially sanctioned violence, but an aberration. Chaos was a mistake. It was a result of inadequate statistics, of non-standardized litters, of overuse of morphine or poor triage rules. This is the classic perspective of modernity, that is that the application of reason and bureaucracy to the technical management of disorder. Weber himself made the comparison to the army. He said modernity was militaristic in its longing for rules that operated without regard to persons. This longing was often manifest in particularly stark and transparent ways in the technical practices built around the state's monopoly on violence. And the second idea that both enterprises share is the idea, and this is shared also by military experts eventually, although it takes a while, the idea that the battlefield is a laboratory or doubles as an experimental laboratory. So the battlefield produces both military results and scientific and technological results. In the 20th century, there was an increasing acceptance of the battlefield as an open-air laboratory or a testing ground for new technologies or new theories. And this acceptance was by scientists, engineers, physicians, and eventually generals. War produces large numbers of destroyed buildings, burned cities, and grievously wounded, gassed, traumatized, and disfigured subjects. And this is the usual basis for the claim that war is somehow good for medicine because war produces traumatic medical results that can be studied. It is explicit, and then that this knowledge that you gain on the battlefield can be productively applied in civilian life. That's a part of this story. It's explicitly the property of the battlefield as a scene of productive destruction that constitutes its experimental potential. Now, I will turn to the story of Carlisle Barracks and the effort to build the perfect litter. Carlisle Army Barracks is in Carlisle, PA. It's the site of the Army War College. It was a fort built in the 1790s, and in September 1918, it became the site of a medical technology research center at which researchers were supposed to learn the lessons of World War I, those lessons being about ambulances, litters, bandages, splints, and so on. The experimental lab that was created at Carlisle Army Barracks was the equivalent of the labs for testing ordnance, for example, at Aberdeen. So medical field technologies were tested, collected at Carlisle, and assessed. The interest in litter research reflects emerging battlefield practices in World War I, where litter evacuations were longer, they were more frequent, and they were more complicated. In the U.S. Civil War, which involved a far longer time period and many other U.S. soldiers, only 50,000 litters were used in the war. In World War I, during the very short period of American Expeditionary Forces being called into action, 375,000 litters were used. Keep in mind also that soldiers today are supplied with a tarp. It is not necessary to have a poled litter with a sort of base to move a soldier. There are many other ways to move a soldier. So my point is that a litter is part of an overall system, a way of thinking about how you move soldiers around and what has to be done when a soldier is wounded. They reflect ways of organizing labor. Now, moving a soldier by litter involves taking up the work of probably 2 to 4 other people besides the wounded soldier. This is an extreme case. I've counted 9 people carrying this litter down a hillside in Italy, including 2 civilians. And so, and what happened is that in both wars, there were some individuals who were litter carriers the entire war. They carried wounded soldiers all day, and they dug graves at night. That was the job of the litter carrier. So this is labor-intensive. It's hard work. It's heavy. It's uncomfortable. And often what you're doing is carrying someone who is grievously wounded and in tremendous pain. Litters were also community property. When you dropped off a soldier, a wounded soldier, you kept them in the litter and you picked up whatever litters were left behind by others. So they circulated, so to speak. And in World War I, there were 10 types of litter in use. These were steel, aluminum, wood, and of different sizes, and so on. Now, I'm going to quote from an Army report after World War I, which said this lack of standardization was a problem. Quote, "Clearly, without a high degree of interchangeable parts, the entire evacuation system is likely to break down. You need a standardized litter or the entire evacuation system will break down." So the standardized litter became a top priority at Carlisle because of its, quote, basic connection with the entire process of casualty evacuation. The Medical Corps lieutenants and in-house historians John B. Johnson and Graves Wilson, who wrote the final report, described the medical department and equipment laboratory engineers as being under tremendous psychological stress as they tried to build a perfect litter in light of the pressure that they were under in the threat of war. They faced material shortages. They had problems with patient comfort. They had problems with litter bearer fatigue, with the interchangeability of parts, and also with the question of global warfare. This is a litter that was developed at Carlisle in the 30s for Arctic evacuation. So as World War II was looming, there was a sense and a recognition that war would be fought in many different places and you might need different kinds of litters. And then this is a World War II evacuation on a rubber boat, and they needed other kinds of litters for lifting wounded soldiers up onto, at sea, on the open sea, lifting them up onto boats, onto ships, and so on. Later, observers noted the uniquely mechanistic and global nature of the war and the fact that this global nature required a very sophisticated evacuation system. Now, all those who interacted with the litter were affected by its physical properties. Litter poles that were too rigid gave the casualty load a deadweight heaviness, which is tiring for the bearers, and made the ride bumpy and painful for patients. Poles which were too resilient tended to bounce the patient and maximize the weight strain on the bearers. So the perfect litter would meet the needs of both the wounded soldier and the bearer and would work within the evacuation system. It would be easy to produce in mass quantities. There'd be no problems with supplies. It would have interchangeable parts, and it would be functional under diverse conditions. The variables in litter production included weight, thickness, shape of the poles, handle tapering, wood type used, shape and type of spreader bars, and the material, linen duck or canvas used in the litter cover. And this is a restricted report comparing, I'm sorry you can't read it, but it's comparing litters that they had collected from 1860 to 1916 of various types and how they worked. The dominant litter of World War I was the 22-pound ash pole litter of 1916. It was temporarily superseded in 1932 by a straight pole, a different straight pole litter that was made with aluminum, a folding aluminum litter, and then aluminum became scarce and the secret Project F-11 began. And for Project F-11, foreign litters were collected and tested. The American Red Cross provided a litter from Czechoslovakia in the fall of 1939. The American Embassy in London acquired a British litter, and before the outbreak of war between the United States and the Axis powers, the military attaché in Berlin secured a German litter, subsequently shipped to the laboratory at Carlisle. The attaché at Ottawa sent a Canadian all-metal litter. In addition, through correspondence, descriptive literature, blueprints, and photographs, information was obtained about litters from Switzerland and Austria. And I quote, "There were 80 years of litter research experiments. There now remained the enormously difficult job of speedily developing a single physical model which would meet all specifications." After 1940, the research group at Carlisle had a deadline of 11 months to build a perfect litter. They drew on the litters they had collected from around the world and on the proposals and test models that were sent to them from the Republic Steel Corporation, the Zimmer Manufacturing Company of Warsaw, Indiana, and the Revere Products Corporation of New York. They adapted these models, trying different shapes, sizes, materials, and structures, and each model was field tested at Carlisle by carriers and by AirSAT's patients. The litters were placed on truck beds with volunteer patients, and they were driven for 40 miles to see how the ride would feel to the patient. They were suspended between two empty medical department chests, and a 150-pound weight was placed in each litter and then removed and replaced 20 times. Quantification, measurement, and so on. Some models failed these tests fairly early. Some were just too complicated to unfold and use, and some were dangerous. I quote from one report, "An actual casualty would have been subject to further injury from shock, as well as the danger of literally falling off of the litter." In early 1942, the medical department board at Carlisle recommended the adoption of a modified litter first proposed by the Zimmer Company, an all-steel straight pole litter, and this was to become the most widely used litter in evacuation in World War II. So in the litter research program, we can see the basic outline of modern reason. It's collaborative. It involves private industry and a military laboratory. It's secret, and its title mimics other names from secret research. It's F11. It's restricted data. It's quantitative. You count how many times things happen, and you track the numbers, and you use the numbers to make decision. And it seeks to produce something that is all the same, but that also meets diverse needs. So standardization, quantification, efficiency, not intuitive reasoning, but scientific rationality applied to something that seems to require no particular sophistication. Now I'm going to turn to the board for the study of the severely wounded, and I'll talk a little bit about the characters here, some of whom you might have heard of, though I'm not really sure. The key person is right there, Henry Beecher. And Henry Beecher is a very famous physiologist and anesthesiologist, and the board for the study of the severely wounded was a key event in Beecher's intellectual life and had huge consequences not only for him but for biomedicine more generally in the 20th century. And the other people who are in this picture are, there's a chemist, Shapiro. Sullivan is a bacteriologist. There are a couple of people from Harvard or Massachusetts General Hospital. There are surgeons. Most of them went on to have illustrious careers in biomedicine or in science in the 20th century. Beecher was born Henry Unangst in Kansas, and he changed his name to Beecher because of his admiration for the Beecher family, that is Henry Ward and Lyman Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And he graduated from the University of Kansas, and then he went to Harvard for medical school and became a protege of Edward Churchill, who also had an impact on his success. He never did get a formal training in anesthesiology. He was trained in physiology, and he was in the ironic position of being the first occupant of an endowed chair of anesthesiology in 1941, and also barred from membership in the American Society of Anesthesiology. And in fact, his fights with the American Society of Anesthesiology continued off and on for most of his career. It's probably safe to say that Beecher was what you would call a contrarian. He fought with a lot of people, sometimes the good fight. But he was he did not mind stirring up trouble. Now, he sought active duty after 1940, and he began to complain to various people, including A.N. Richards, who was the chair of the Committee on Medical Research of the Office of Scientific Research. He began to complain that he didn't want to be stuck at Harvard. Beecher was exempt from service in the war, and indeed he was supposed to stay home because of his crucial role in medicine in the United States. But what he was complaining about was that the committee was funding and supporting research into anesthesia and shock in animals. And Beecher was saying, why aren't we out doing this research on the battlefield? It's not going to do us any good to work with animals. We can only settle these questions on human subjects. And he said, and I quote, why aren't we doing this, quote, where there is an abundance of material, namely at one of the active fronts? In civil practice, so few people are operated on in shock that they do not constitute an adequate testing ground. The opportunity of a generation, or perhaps many generations, is slipping through our fingers. So the war is an opportunity to do research. Where else are you going to have tons of people who you have to do surgery on while they're in shock? In 1943, Beecher won this argument. He was commissioned a major in the U.S. Army, and he spent 25 months serving in North Africa, Italy, and France. And this work led to his 1949 book, Resuscitation and Anesthesia for Wounded Men. Now, the board that he traveled with consisted of about 25 people. I think they had 7 trucks, and they had a mobile laboratory, and they had some laboratory tents. And they had drivers and support personnel. And what they basically did was to track the bodies. They tracked, quote, maximum military activity. So they followed the troops at just a far enough remove that they could get the most severely wounded soldiers. In 9 months, and this was from 19 September of 44 to mid-May of 45, they worked with 186 men who had been severely wounded. 6 of these men were civilians, 13 were German POWs, all the rest were U.S. soldiers who had been wounded either in battle or in accidents associated with military action. And of this group, 186, 65 died, which was twice the field average, but it was not a problem in a way because Beecher was only sent the soldiers who were hovering near death, who were most grievously wounded and most likely to die already. The mandate for the research in the field was to solve 4 problems. First, shock, which was the major problem. Second was transfusion. At this point in the war, there were very large, dramatic transfusions with type O blood, and they were having trouble with people who got large transfusions of type O blood. They were trying to figure out what was wrong. They were trying to track metabolism in severe injury, and they were trying to find out why kidney failure occurred. Beecher himself was also interested in pain and morphine, and you can see in his notes that he was all along trying to track how much morphine had soldiers been given. Now, his narrative style in his presentation of this research in both the original papers and in his later writing was remarkable for its immediacy and its informal cadence. He wrote about how wounded men and doctors felt and interacted, about the personalities of people as they oscillated at the edge of life and death. and about the fact that the badly injured are nearly always clear mentally if they were not in shock. He said that the patients newly wounded sometimes experienced euphoria in the first day or so because their wounds were in effect a release from the conditions of battle. Quote, the overwhelming realization that come what may, the war is suddenly over for the individual. Now, it was the work on pain with these severely wounded soldiers that later led to Beecher's interest in the placebo effect, and Beecher is the author of the famous placebo effect paper in 1955. And what he was doing in Italy, North Africa, and France on all these fronts was interviewing, as they arrived at field hospitals, a selected group of 225 men who had severe injuries. The selection of these subjects was as consecutive as the criteria permit, the object being to select patients with major injuries in certain categories in a systematic, quantitatively balanced series. So he wanted 50 soldiers each who had penetrating wounds of the thorax, the abdomen, compound fractures of long bones, and extensive crushing injuries, and he wanted 25 others who had severe, life-threatening head injuries. In the field, then, Beecher selected representative wounds that he presented in various publications as equivalent to those produced by auto accidents and other civilian traumas. Beecher and his colleagues asked each soldier if he was in any pain. And the question they asked was, as you lie there, are you having any pain? 32% said none at all, and remember, all of these soldiers have severe injuries. 32% said none. Those who did say they had pain were asked to rate their pain from light, moderate, and severe. That's what it was, yes, slight, moderate, or severe. And 25.6% said their pain was slight. 18.6% said it was moderate, and 23.7% said it was severe. All had life-threatening injuries, but only 23.7% reported feeling severe pain. Now, Beecher wrote, these replies were not in accord with the long-accepted generalization that all extensive wounds are associated with severe pain. And it was these interviews that later led Beecher to conclude that if he had been testing a pain medication on these soldiers, he would have reached the incorrect conclusion that his pain medication was extremely effective. And that was why Beecher proposed that the placebo effect was important, because when you were testing a drug, you needed to see what happened when people weren't given the drug, when a control group was given not given a drug but believed they had been given a drug. Beecher's group, in documenting the physiological consequences of severe wounds, suggested that their work quantified in ample numbers the relationships between blood loss and shock that had long been recognized but not subjected to rigorous field testing. And I quote again from his book, this was from a paper actually earlier. The proof was needed to outride the storms which arise again and again from suggestions that the cause of shock is mysterious and is to be explained by toxins or by the breakdown of some vague but vital force. For the technical experts on the board for the study of the severely wounded, the battlefield was a laboratory where long-standing questions about shock and pain could be resolved. Later, Beecher replicated this form of research in Korea, a battlefield that he found more traumatic than the Italian front in World War II. Korea, more than World War II, was understood from the beginning as a working field laboratory from the perspective of many disciplines. And I think at some point I'm going to write a chapter called The Experimental War, which is going to focus on Korea. From the beginning, Korea, in every possible domain, was seen as an experimental site. And scientists of various kinds were out in the field very early and throughout the Korean War. Beecher's mentor and friend, Edward Churchill, who was Chief of General Surgical Services at MGH, proposed later that both military and medical thinking about the war had changed from 42 to 45. He said at the beginning of the war, the common wisdom was that only procedures that were completely understood and standardized should be used on the battlefield for the support of combat forces. Anything that happened in scientific laboratories in the United States was relatively trivial compared at the beginning in his construction, compared to the sort of practical demands of the field. It was not generally understood Churchill said that the experience in the field could point the way toward more immediate and radical changes of methods and equipment. However, combat components pointed the way to the experimental medical battlefield, the laboratory of the open air, by turning to experts to solve problems in the new machines of war. Many were the bugs that remained in new tanks, planes, and missiles, and these defects were constantly being ironed out, he said. Combat commanders might not have the technical expertise they needed to solve field problems and may not even be able to define those problems in terms that can lead to a solution. They needed chemists, physicists, engineers, and physicians out on the battlefield to guide their daily work. For surgeons concerned with the effects of trauma, he said, the Mediterranean theater provided a favorable environment for research. And I quote, "It was an experimental laboratory, not only for surgery, but for medicine as a whole, for ordnance, and for equipment." Beecher's work in Italy reflected precisely this construction of the battlefield as an experimental arena. Beecher called the board a clinic that stretched 2,000 miles from Casablanca to Trieste, a place where they had been granted an extraordinary opportunity to learn. The Italian field laboratory provided him with fascinating problems that absorbed his intellectual life for many years. And after the war, Beecher wrote papers that defined the placebo effect, questioned the management of human subjects, and called for informed consent. Beecher began to talk about this issue in about 1956. He gave a major lecture on it in 1959, and he published a series of papers that were generally ignored in 61, 63. The famous paper that everyone remembers is 1966, and that's when Beecher presented in the New England Journal of Medicine, because JAMA would not accept it, presented a paper which documented 40 cases of immoral or unethical biomedical research in the American literature, and he provided all the footnotes to the editors, but the footnotes were not in the published paper for fear that they would humiliate the persons involved in this research. So in the process, Beecher I won't say he's responsible in a single-handed way, but he certainly played a critical role in the rise of the IRB, in the use of placebos. He was the notion that all trials must be controlled, and Beecher was furthermore the chair at Harvard in 1968 of the committee that defined brain death as the point at which death actually occurs. The heart beating had been the previous point at which death occurred, and moving death to the brain facilitated the entire transplant industry. So Beecher, has a huge impact in all kinds of policy ways. When his service ended in the summer of 1945, he wrote to his commanding officer that, quote, "Work in this theater under your guidance has been an experience that will influence the whole course of my life." And he was certainly correct about that. Now, in considering a little research project and a project to study severely wounded men, I look at a technical network with wounded soldiers at its center and at the forms of technical knowledge that could be marshaled to increase the efficiency of active battle by managing wounded bodies. The systems built around evacuating, treating, and studying wounded soldiers reflected the larger enterprise of industrialized and scientific war. It required disciplined litters built of the proper materials, handled by trained bearers, and medical experts who could quickly calculate the next step, morphine, a splint, or a trip back to the front. The text describing these knowledge systems emphasized the power of organizations, numbers, charts, and quantitative analysis. And this is actually just a chart of non-effectives, also not very easy to read, tracking exactly what took people out of commission. But I can assure you that there probably is in your library here, and there certainly is at Penn, many, many, many volumes documenting the work of the technical services in World War II and containing charts like number of persons wounded on light cruisers during the Battle of Okinawa. In other words, very specialized charts, very massive data collection, statistics, tracking everything, and numbers as a solution to this problem. In his philosophical study of the haunting combination of violence and transcendence in the life and work of the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, Charles Thorpe explores the ideas of scholars in the history of science that reason and science have provided a solution to the problem of violence. George Sarton, the founder of academic history of science in the United States, proposed in 1948, a non-trivial date, 1948, that science makes for peace more than anything else in the world. His student Robert Merton echoed these ideas in his formulation of the universalistic norms that drove technical knowledge production. And Chapin and Schaffer in Leviathan and the Air Pump proposed that experimental philosophy was understood by its practitioners to be a means of securing assent without recourse to coercion or violent conflict. The power of the experimental matter of fact to command rational agreement made experiment a platform for the reconstruction of peaceful social and political order in the wake of civil war. But it would be hard to imagine how science, technology, and medicine would look today if they had not proven to be relevant to violence. Foucault's truth was a thing of this world, and the modern intellectual for him was a strategist of life and death. In battlefield research, these strategies of life and death are explicit in a way that they may not be in other sites. The battlefield is not a normal laboratory. It is a laboratory of uncontrolled but abundant destruction. So it's common in a controlled laboratory that you do destroy things. You kill mice, you damage mice. A battlefield is not about control, but it is about excess. It can be organized to resemble the laboratory. You can have quantitative analysis. You can select your victims so that you have a controlled series. You can choose representative wounds. Linking my two laboratories that I've talked about today are wounded soldiers. Litters carried only the most seriously wounded soldiers. Anyone who was capable of walking had to walk, and they would commonly be tagged in this way. So all the people who are in the litters are people who are in pain, and they are the very people who would be more likely to be turned over to Beecher and his colleagues. They were probably arriving on litters that were designed at Carlisle Army Barracks, and they were the most likely to die of shock. They were non-effectives in the parsimony of military charts, but they were also heroes, warriors, and symbols of masculinity and courage. And this is a soldier at Iwo Jima, which I think captures some of that symbolic power of the wounded soldier. They placed terrible demands on scarce resources. They were a drain on the system, multiplying when they were most superfluous, so to speak. That is, during major offenses, you have many more wounded soldiers. And so they had a paradoxical dual status as emotionally meaningful and tactically inconvenient and a drain on the industrialized system. I close by suggesting that noticing how technical expertise was deployed on their behalf is relevant to historical understanding of the general militarization of technical knowledge in the 20th century and also to the application of technical rationality to war. The severely wounded man in Evacuation moves from unreason and disorder from the battlefield into the rational world of medicine, technology, and science, and is therefore a point of entry to the questions raised by militarization and science, because in these soldiers, reason and unreason coalesce. This happens more generally in the militarization of technical knowledge, and one of the themes I'm exploring in my broader work is the sort of paradox of the capacity to make new knowledge that focuses on the production of human injury. And so you can make knowledge that is intended to heal and knowledge that is intended to injure. And what has it meant for science, medicine, and technology that so much knowledge has been produced with the intent of causing human injury? Now, I'm closing with a final image of a litter evacuation showing a group crossing a swollen stream at Lindee. We cannot see the face of the person being carried. He might have been in shock. He might have been euphoric because the war was over for him. We do know that he was probably being carried on the straight pole litter proposed by the Zimmer Company and developed at Carlisle Barracks, PA. And we know that he's probably being taken to the first node in the network of evacuation, the battalion aid station, where he will be treated and returned to the front or stabilized and sent along for surgery. We know, too, that at the moment this photo was taken, he was suspended between brutality and reason, violence and medicine, and perhaps death and life. The wounded soldier being carried on the litter from the battlefront to an aid station occupies a social location at which the intermingled properties of 20th century industrialized war, its stunning technical sophistication, and its brutality are simultaneously visible. Thank you. I'd be happy to talk about this project and where it's going, and I hope you have some questions. Yes?
I'm wondering, when did, not so much in the medical corps, but when did quantification become so key for the War Department itself? Post-Civil War phenomenon?
No, there's a lot of quantification in the Civil War, and there's a huge medical documentation project for the Civil War. And I think it's somewhere between about 1800 and 1830. The Surgeon General's office was created in 1832 or something like that. So it's right in that period. And the explicit original purpose of the Surgeon General, the office itself, was to collect data. So it was a data, we're just going to track. We're going to track all these numbers. So it's not exactly, it's not as though it comes in as war. I don't know, it depends on where you want to say the industrialization of war begins, because you can move it back to 1780 and interchangeable parts in France if you want. But, you know, generally people say the industrialization of war is the 19th century. And this is probably a part of it, this sort of obsessive collection of numbers and collection of charts. And the problem with so many numbers is that, you know, I've read a lot of these charts, and you don't know what to do with them. Like, what do I do with them as a historian? They're not really informative, except they're informative about a set of practices and expectations about how to solve the problem of war. But they don't tell you that much. They're sort of obsessive collections of data.
That's interesting. It may actually be coming from the medical side, because the ordnance department before the Civil War, there are tables, but it's not obsessive like this.
Yeah, it might be coming from the medical side. It's possible, and it may be that that's about solving, you know, problems of disease. The fact that most people in most wars died of disease until World War I. Is the first war where more people died of battle wounds than died of disease. And physicians in the late 19th century or mid-19th century, there's a sort of shameful story about what a terrible job they're doing because soldiers are dying of disease. They're not controlling it. The Civil War was a disaster in terms of disease, but as was World War I. But if you don't count the epidemic, then you have more battle deaths than you do deaths from disease. And I think the Spanish-American War was the worst. The ratio of disease to battle death was 20-1, something like that. So that was a disaster. Yeah. Yes, Gina?
I was wondering if there's a similar industry
That is a great question, and there's a wonderful book by Sledge called Soldier Dead, in which he tracks the technical systems. What do you do with a dead soldier? And it's amazing, all the rules about where the soldier can be stored. It has this, part of the reason, once they're dead, they're relics. They're no longer industrial efficient. They're no longer objects of industrial efficient management. And so partly with these wounded soldiers, the goal is to fix them up as quickly as possible and get them back to the front. And how badly injured you had to be in order to be sent back to the United States, which is the ultimate goal if you're truly badly injured, shifted depending on how the war was going. If the war was going badly, then how sick you had to be went up, because they needed more people at the front. But when they die, they move into a totally, they move into the domain of the sacral. And then they're holy objects, and they have to be shipped in a certain way and treated, and you know, there's all this paperwork around them, and finding them, you know, retrieving the bodies is very important. So partly what I'm doing when I focus on these wounded soldiers is I'm saying they're not only between reason and violence, they're also suspended between the sacred, you know, the end of life, the fundamental questions, and normal life. So they're hovering near life and death, and as soon as you're there, you're close to questions of spiritual life. But Sledge did a great job on just figuring out what it is that, and he's not a historian, I think he's a journalist, but he had full access to all DOD policies and practices, and he interviewed families, and you know, they talked about what do you do with these soldiers' bodies. But yes, I mean, I'm sure, I don't think he talked a lot about coffins, although there are specific kinds of coffins in which soldiers are placed, and they have to look a certain way, be a certain kind of material. So.
Yeah, because you have to transport them reason to reason to terminate.
You do. And you've got to, and in World War II, you had to transport them a long way, because if they died in the Pacific, or, you know, if they died in that theater, they've got to come by sea, vulnerable, you know, on ships that were vulnerable to being sunk in various ways. And so they, you know, you could lose them in various ways, but this kind of long distance shipping and all the protocols that had to be followed around these bodies, and what you had to do when you got them home, and I mean, it's a very elaborate system, but it's not. At that point, it's not reason. You know, it's something else. It's the dead. It's the sacred object. Yeah, it is. It's just it's symbolic. It's now you know, it can't be healed. It can't be brought back into the efficient management of the war. So originally, part of what I started with was this question: why bother with evacuating a wounded soldier? What does that tell you about an efficient military system? Yes?
You mentioned that amongst Beecher's experimental subjects were German prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Given his later work, do you know whether he had any awareness or sensitivity as to the legal and ethical issues of using prisoners of war at that time? Does he reflect on that in his writing?
He doesn't. It's a very interesting question, because I read I worked with his papers, and I read his published materials, and what my conclusion is that the experience, first of all, remember, some of the people he's working on at the front are unconscious. So we're not talking informed consent. And many of them were so grievously wounded that you know, there was really no way to get informed consent from him. This is not, so in this early research, he does not conform to his own later ideas about ethical research. And you could say that the experience, in a way, sensitized him, and he said in the maybe not the 66 one, but in the 59 one, he says, you know, my own practices are not above reproach. I have myself engaged in not seeking informed consent. And I take that as a reference, at least partly, to his work, not just with the German POWs, but also with all the people who were grievously wounded, because there were civilians as well. The other thing is that Beecher, this also shaped him, and I didn't talk about it, Beecher was one of the physicians who was called in to read the medical records from the camps. So he was an interpreter. He was asked by the Army to come in and read these records and assess what had gone on in the camps. And so he's a part of Nuremberg. He's a part of this debate about what the Germans had done, and that enlightened or sensitized him to bioethical issues as well.
If I can just come back to one point, not so much just thinking about informed consent, but also more broadly the question of whether or not the person before him was a German soldier, whether that might influence his selection of that subject for experimental treatment rather than whether, you know, we often think of research ethics as being about informed consent. There's so much more to it, of course.
Right,
so
right.
I'm wondering if I also questions of
he doesn't articulate that question, and most of the for the board, he selected soldiers in other contexts, but the Germans were in the board sent to the board for the study of severely wounded, and as far as I can tell, he didn't select those people. It was the battalion aid station. So when someone came in who was really bloody, they would say, "Oh, take him over to Beecher, take him to the board," and so it's not so in that high emergency context, it's not clear that he was actually picking those soldiers. But where it might have come up more generally would be in the 50 each, the selected ones, where he would go and interview people, and he was trying to find 50 certain kinds of injuries, and he'd reject people because they weren't injured quite enough, or so. There he truly was engaged in the selection of research subjects, but he does not agonize about it. I think what you're talking about with the German POWs would be something like a vulnerable population. But everybody he was working with was vulnerable, and this is in war, and there's a sort of crisis mentality, and he was working with people, most of whom were very seriously wounded. So he does not explicitly talk about that in his notes or in his his correspondence in this time period. He doesn't say, "I'm worried about how I'm choosing research subjects." He was not, for the board, he was not choosing them. They were just coming to him. And as far as I can tell, they never rejected. In other words, the aid station would make the decision, and they never said, "No, you guys take this guy." So it was like, "We'll take anybody you're willing to give us." I think that was the trade. We'll work on anybody who'll come our way, because clearly some of those sent to the board were in less serious shape than others, which you would expect. This is chaotic, So he might have had the option of saying, "I don't want to work on German POWs," but he didn't say that, and he didn't say, "I don't want to work on civilians." So there were Italian civilians who were injured also, and he could have said, "I'll work on our soldiers, but not anybody else," but he didn't. But the rest of his life, he really did agonize about all these questions in a very articulate way. And I think that young surgeon out in the field was learning a lot of different lessons about power and what it means to be a doctor and doing research. So, Yeah, Chloe.
One of the things that struck me as I was listening to this is that there are many similarities to the present, right? So one of the things that you constantly hear during the present war is the speed with which soldiers are evacuated from the battlefield to often to hospitals in Germany at this point.
Right.
So it's this very, very speedy, long distance evacuation.
Very fast.
And I was wondering, but the thing I was wondering about is whether the logic and rhetorics of justification for doing certain kinds of research or extracting information from wounded bodies have changed over time, if you could speculate about this. It sounded like Beecher had to present his research as something that would have utility outside of wartime, so he was selecting those soldiers based on their similarity to automobile. And
he says that over and over. This is just like auto accidents. Yeah.
Whereas, now they talk about polytrauma and things that just don't happen in daily life. The kinds of injuries that you get on the battlefield now are things that you don't see anywhere else, that don't happen to bodies. So
right.
Has the language in which people talk about what we learned from wounded soldiers changed?
That is I would have to look at how people justify polytrauma. My guess is that they don't have to say it's about auto accidents anymore, and that they can just say this is about helping our soldiers survive. But what happened to evacuation systems in the course of in the period after 1945? First, in Korea, the helicopters were widely used in Korea for evacuation, and evacuation became much faster. And you can see charts in which survival rates, level of injury, level of shock, rate of survival, the key thing determining that rate is speed. And once they figured that out, that's Korea, that's Vietnam, they figured the quicker you get them out, and that's why the emphasis now is on speed. You get them out more quickly. But part of what happens, as you know, is that when people survive who have really serious, overwhelming injuries, they face a lifetime of pretty profound disability. So you have more survival. people with worse injuries surviving and also facing real struggles with the survival. But I don't believe, I haven't read recent justifications for using wounded soldiers in research, and I'm not even positive that it happens this way anymore. Because Beecher, remember, wants to do this from Harvard, and he's interested in shock. And I think most of the research now done on wounded soldiers is done by this very sophisticated military medical system. I subscribe to a military medical journal, which is produced at Fort Sam Houston, and they always have stories about their own researchers who are doing this stuff. So they're within, they don't have to write a paper and say, I can justify this on outside. They can say, this is for us. We need to know how to do this. They're inside the military organization. People working on these soldiers overwhelmingly are inside. They're part of it. It's their enterprise. Yes?
I really like the last image you presented in the concluding part, how there seems the soldiers in a delicate situation between chaos and reason. Mm-hmm. And we see as medicine in this, I see as playing almost like a neutral role. They're healing, and whether or not the patient's going to return to the battlefield or go home, it's still, it's playing a neutral role in whichever way the coin seems to fall. Happens. Now, how does this, do you have any thoughts about that old medicine compared to current ethical issues coming up in Guantanamo and the use of psychiatrists, and then how that's changing this little dynamic we've got here? And is it actually shifting the balance now?
Well, the American Psychiatric Association has a sort of incoherent reaction to the role of psychiatrists at Guantanamo, and has had leading lights in the association have been involved in studies on how to question prisoners, but the Psychiatric Association also has an explicit rule against that. Now, what I'm not willing to do is to say medicine is a single huge clump of stuff, because it's not. And medical expertise plays all kinds of different roles in war at different times. So it's not exact. So even at this time, you might say medical expertise is engaged in both benevolent and healing activities and activities that are more suspicious or problematic. And I have two that I usually think of in this way, and it's not simple, okay? But one is wound ballistics. Wound ballistics was the effort to develop a better bullet by shooting cats. Basically, that was mostly, they shot apes and cats. And that project began in 1939 at Princeton, and they shot maybe, several thousand cats over the years, and took very detailed, I wish I had brought that. I was going to bring the cat picture. I have a picture of a cat being shot through the abdomen. It's an X-ray photograph of the bullet going right through the abdomen of the cat. And I see that picture as a really powerful symbol of technical expertise, knowledge of the body turned to how to make the body how to cause more damage in the body. And there's a book by Eric Prakash, he has a chapter on wound ballistics called, the book is called The Technology of Killing. He has a chapter on wound ballistics, but I think equally compelling is his study of the anti-personnel mines. And there was a certain mine that was developed, I guess, in 1965 with little thousands of flechettes. And he looks at how physicians provided testimony about exactly where the flechettes should release so that they would do the most damage. So where do you cut here and where do you cut here? In Korea, what they did, and actually this was in 1952, but it was drawing on data from World War II, physicians mapped the location of bodily wounds on 635 killed in action in a certain campaign. And using this map, they had a single body with all the fatal wounds on it. They could figure out what the best place is to kill somebody. And so you think about, that's turning medical expertise, the understanding of the heart, the brain, the skin. There's all this stuff on what exactly is the point at which you break the skin with a bullet, how much energy is used up when you break the skin, how much energy when you hit a bone, how much energy when you go through the liquid tissue. So there's a sort of physics involved, there's medicine involved, and all of it is built around figuring out how to make a bullet or an anti-personnel mine that will do more damage more quickly and more efficiently. So that's what I would call definitely medical knowledge, which is somewhat problematic. That's turning your knowledge of the body to the bodily destruction. There's another even more ambiguous case, and that's aviation medicine. Aviation medicine, there were all these proponents of aviation medicine. Once you start putting people up in the air and they've got to fly over up for long periods of time, maybe places where it's cold or they don't have, eventually they get to where they don't have enough oxygen. So how do you keep them flying? How do you keep them okay? A lot of aviation medicine is about psychology because it's pretty uncomfortable to do this, to go up into this little plane with a group of people for a long time, go on a bombing mission, vulnerable the whole time. How do you predict which ones are going to get really sick? And how do you prepare them psychologically for what's going to happen to them up in the air? Physicians, psychologists, engineers, all were working together in aviation medicine to build a better cockpit and basically to ensure that the crews in these planes, and it's explicit in this literature, that the crews would be able to continue their bombing runs. So you're keeping the crew alive because you want to make sure that it can get the bombing run done. Now, they're not saying, I want to kill those people on the ground. But they're building a network that facilitates injury to persons who are on the ground. And for the purposes of my analysis, it doesn't matter that the people on the ground are understood to be enemies of the United States. That's not quite the issue. Because if I say this to people who, to a certain audience, they'll say, well, they had to kill them. They were the enemies of the United States. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what happens when you get technical expertise applied and built around the specific goal of creating human injury. And the point of aviation medicine is to say you can do that even by taking care of the pilot and the crew, making them psychologically healthy, testing them. They built the first... what was it called? The Rollo plane. The first thing that was to test how quickly pilots would get nauseated was an adapted amusement park ride. And one of the planners for aviation medicine went to amusement parks over the summer, found one that was truly nauseating, and contacted the manufacturer and said, can you make us one for the lab? But we want it a little bit better. We want it a little more nauseating to roll around a little bit faster. So the Rollo plane became the first, whatever you call that thing, motion tester for pilots, prospective pilots. And that's another way that you screen out people to make sure that they'll make it, because some people get nauseated very quickly and some people don't. And so you test them in the lab. Who's going to get nauseated? Who has the psychological stuff? And how do you make sure that they can tolerate the cold? So there were all kinds of ways to wrap them up. Eventually, of course, oxygen and enclosed cockpits and all kinds of ways that you help crews survive. But the entire enterprise is built around facilitating human injury on the ground of persons who are identified as enemies. And that's basically knowledge to heal and knowledge to injure at the exact same time. It's that simultaneity. It's the coalescing of reason and violence that I'm trying to track in these various locations and to understand. And I'm not trying to say everyone who worked in aviation medicine was evil, because they weren't. I'm trying to say this enterprise, this is how power works in this enterprise. So, I'm kind of defending myself against accusations that you're not making, but I know what these accusations look like, So, any students have a question? Come on. It's all professors up here.
I have 25 of my bioethics students here.
There has to be a bioethics student who has a question. Do you have a question? Yeah, it's very interesting, huh?
Did they ever consider the psychology of why after they were evacuated?
Well, Beecher doesn't think about that, but certainly there's a lot of psychological work on the consequences of redeployment, and especially partly because there were drastic differences in mental breakdown in World War I in different armies, and armies that circulated people fairly quickly, like 7 days on, 7 days off, which is what the U.S. did, and armies that left people for long terms. In some cases, I think the French left people for 39 days in the front trenches. You couldn't, to make it 30, we would all be insane if we spent 39 days in the front trenches. So your rates of mental breakdown were much higher, and during World War I and after World War I, there were efforts to do psychological research to find out the optimum, the perfect amount of time that you could leave people in an untenable, unsurvivable situation and then bring them back, let them eat, let them take a shower, and then send them back. But the disaster of World War I is precisely the psychological impact of escaping, going back, escaping, going back, and going back over and over again to the same little line of trench with no progress having been made. So it's, if you think about, there's a huge literature on the psychology of the soldier. There was a massive psychological study in World War I, many debates about what causes these kinds of consequences. Beecher said that about euphoria almost as a throwaway line. Beecher just said these guys are saying, or they're really happy and excited. And he was just curious about it, but he didn't do a systematic study because he was doing shock. But many other people have, and there's a really large literature on the psychology of battlefield experience. Come on, another bio. Yes?
Do you know if there's any difference today in how soldiers respond to being wounded in battle? Because you had said that in World War I and II, a lot of them were euphoric, but since the conditions of battle in Iraq today are completely different, do they still see soldiers that respond that way?
You mean with euphoria?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, it kind of makes common sense, but I don't know that anyone has tracked that in contemporary evacuation. And I would, given that the level at which you can be sent back into battle, the level of injury after which you can be sent back into battle is higher, I think the euphoria might be premature in some cases because many more, as I mentioned, many more people survive grievous injury, but also the management and treatment of many kinds of injuries has improved so thoroughly that it's possible to get people back into the war more quickly, more efficiently, with greater injury. And the whole system I'm talking about is focused on the efficient management of resources. That is, the soldier as an industrialized resource that has to be managed efficiently, that needs to be brought back into battle, processed very quickly, maintained as a resource. So it's not, I don't actually know if people are euphoric today. I would guess they are, but I would guess that in many cases they will be sent back to the front. And that makes perfect sense. Yes?
I'd like to pick you up on a point you made in passing. All my students here, the ones who are being silent too, have all read a great deal about the role of physicians in death in various guises, whether it be physicians, suicide, death by lethal injection, or indeed on the topic that this questioner touched on, the role of psychiatrists and psychologists in interrogation and application and
Right.
Bay. I just wanted to sort of probe you a little bit more on that because you suggested that the American Psychiatric Association's position was somewhat inconsistent.
Yeah, I think it is.
And can you just explain for the benefit of my students why you think that?
Because psychiatrists, and I know why I think this, and I can't remember the name of the committee, but there's a committee formed by the Psychiatric Association that is intended to help questioners understand how to ask questions. That is, that has little bits of advice, like, people get kind of upset if you do this. So it's as though formally for a psychiatrist to participate in torture in this way is prohibited. But to help a military, there's a whole literature. Remember, military psychology is one of the subfields of the APA. they have their own, it's Division B1, so they have their own sub-meeting and they have these reports, and most people who are military psychologists are trained by the military. They might go out into other careers. So I'm not saying they're hopeless hypocrites, but I'm saying that they operate, they're facilitating not torture, but the efficient questioning. How do you use psychology to come up with ways to question people, and then a ban on certain kinds of participation.
So your view is that the American Psychiatric Association should have adopted a position similar to the American Psychological Association? Because the Psychiatric Association said no participation in any interrogation, full stop. The Psychological Association said, well, you can participate in interrogation as long as it's not torture, cruel, inhumane, violates the fundamental right.
Yeah.
So you say the Psychiatric Association should have adopted the Psychological Association position for that.
Now I haven't read all the position papers, but I'm willing to follow you on that argument. Or I'm not even talking about should. I'm saying these are, here's the question for me. I'm interested in how disciplinary groups come to terms with the relevance of what they know to defense, to national defense. So how do they come up with rules that limit the consequences for them as a group? How do they decide where to draw the line? What's an inappropriate thing to do? What is an offense and what isn't? And historically, how have they negotiated the really problematic interest of the Defense Department in their research? And the bigger project is about the strategies of experts, so I categorize strategies. And one strategy is to say, it's great that we're relevant to defense, and we love it. It gets us a lot of money. And I guess Edward Teller is our key example of that. You know, Edward Teller couldn't be happier. He's happy to be a Cold Warrior. He wants to build bigger and better bombs, and he says in several places in his autobiography, I'm so happy I was born in a time when I could build weapons like this. Okay, so he's ecstatic. Then you think about, in the physicists, someone like James Franck or even J. Robert Oppenheimer, people who hesitate a little bit. They're involved. They participate in building the weapon. But then they say, gee, there's kind of an ethical line here. We need to do something about it. Then at a lower level, these are famous people. At a lower level, you have people who say, I'm willing to work in the military-industrial complex, but I'm not willing to work there for more than a couple of years. Or I'm not willing to work there unless I can still publish my research. Then you have individuals who work in the military-industrial complex, and they say things like, it's true that I make the trigger, but I'm not actually involved in designing the bomb. So I'm not actually involved in injury. So they draw a line around their labor is not directly for that labor. So for the psychiatrists and the psychologists, the interesting point is, and think of the microbiologists. The microbiologists say, you can't do secret research on biological weapons. That's against the rule. But the presidents of the ASM, I think about 5 or 6 in a row, all worked at Dietrich. So you have, working together, and maybe they're saying I'm not doing secret biological weapons research, but for microbiology, biological weapons research is just a huge part of the enterprise. I'm interested in how people come to terms with that. And the reason I know that it matters to them is because they do all these. If they all just said, this is fine, we're not worried about it at all, it would be different. But they do all this splitting and all this rules and all this boundary work to say, this much I'll do, this much I won't. Another thing I found when I was looking at the papers of some mathematicians is that they worried about sexuality. Homosexual persons were viewed as particularly vulnerable to being blackmailed and outed. And so they would say, well, he might be good, he can't really do any defense work. Because of what, it's all kind of veiled in the 50s. He can't do defense work because of his, he could easily be blackmailed or something. But, and then also the idea that, and this was really explicit, I actually talked with a British historian, this was explicit in Britain too, that anybody who was gay was not appropriate for working in the defense industry. And then another thing is that anyone who had ever even remotely been interested in the Communist Party, had been involved in any Communist Party group, they would be steered. If you had a student who had been a member of the Communist Party, you might well steer them out of defense research or out of research areas where defense interest was high. So he really should just work in botany, because this is, there's an area where it's not going to matter. Physics, forget it. He can't work in physics. So for the psychiatrist, then, the interest is in how do they, by what logic, that's what I'm interested in, by what logic do they decide that certain kinds of activities are problematic and certain kinds aren't? And if we get that logic, then we can see something, and I'm not sure exactly what, but we can see something about the strategies and practices of expertise and the consequences for experts and for knowledge production of the vast militarization of science, technology, and medicine in the 20th century. That this is the fundamental experience of being an expert in the 20th century, and no psychiatrist can ignore it. It's not something they can ignore. They have to make a decision. They have to come to terms with it. So what deals do they make? Yeah.
Just to follow on that, for those who do express discomfort with their involvement,
Yes.
and I recognize that you're beginning this in some respects, do they express their discomfort in terms of their personal beliefs and reservations, or do they ever express it in terms of a kind of global set of expectations regarding professional ethics, either something like the Hippocratic Oath or something more general involving kind of normative behavior in science? This project involves secrecy. We don't do secrecy. So are they expressing it in terms of professional expectations or personal beliefs, or some kind of admixture?
Sometimes it is professional expectations, particularly for the statements by professional groups. Like once you get the anthropologists talking, they go nuts over absolute, standards for rules. So the anthropologists, after the Camelot, which was a social science project linked to the Pentagon, intended to develop social science information about insurgent groups all over the world. Once this came out, the anthropologists then said, it's wrong, it's absolutely wrong, nobody engaged, nobody should do this kind of thing. And this is kind of true for the microbiologists. They invoke a kind of universal rule that says no one should be engaged in this kind of research. For the more subtle stuff, nobody says in a letter, I have reservations because I'm worried about peace. And no, people don't, that's not the way they talk about it. It's almost more, and I might find people eventually who talk that way, but it's almost more like the given common sense of the community that certain kinds of involvement with the military pose ethical problems. And it's even a little bit hush-hush, like it's kind of muted. It's not always overt. It's overt in the public statements, and it's overt in the big debates. I mean, the physicists, J. Robert Oppenheimer goes, he invokes everything to suggest that there are problems here. So different people use different strategies, but I would say for the stuff that really interests me, which is that little trickle-down, subtle, almost not a fully articulated concern, the point at which the individual struggles to come to terms with his or her obligations to the state, I haven't seen anyone be too overt about it. It's just kind of, okay, what should I do here? And the model I'm drawing on, I don't know if any of you have read Margaret Roster's Women Scientists in America, but one of the wonderful things she was able to do was to show, by reading, I don't know how many letters, to show the very subtle ways that gender was performed in technical knowledge systems. And it's not like people write letters and they say all women are stupid. It's very subtle. And it's sort of like, well, I don't think you should recommend her for that fellowship. I've got a nice young man. And no one, but by compiling how this system worked, slowly, laboriously, by all these little points, you can see how thoroughly fellowships, jobs, positions at the federal government, all kinds of research positions, how anybody who was female was quietly steered, discouraged, fired, left out of certain research systems and research agendas. And what I want to do is, and not necessarily overtly, not dramatically, not any, generally, I mean, there's some people who say all women are stupid, but that's not the common thing. The common thing is much more like everybody knows that you wouldn't want a woman in the lab. You know, everyone knows that because they're trouble. And then you know, to ask the source, well, what kind of trouble are they? Exactly, what trouble are they? And that's not there. You know, you might be able to get somebody else saying, well, if she's here, it might raise problems for Smith. Why? Why is that going to raise problems? So it's probably pretty hard to get at, but that's the kind of thing I'm trying to understand. What kind of trouble is the state's interest in technical knowledge for experts? What kind of trouble is it? Where do they draw the line? Where do they choke? Why does it bother them? How does it bother them? And how does that bothering shape what they do and how they think? Yeah.
I'm just curious, and I'm not in any way attacking that position, but will you deal with the sort of devil's bargain that was made, that so much research wouldn't have been done without defense money? I mean, it's maybe not the best choice, but it was the choice that we as a society made, and the expansion of science in the 20th century is on the backs of military money.
Oh, that's my point. Yeah. The expansion of science, medicine, and technology in the 20th century are military phenomena.
Right. But I could easily see a reviewer saying, well, yes, there are all these problems, but they would have had the research to do if it wasn't for the money.
I think unequivocally that without defense interest, without the state's interest in productive violence, that science, technology, and medicine would not look the way they do today, that we would not have certain disciplines, materials science, operations research, oceanography would be far retarded, meteorology would probably not be as sophisticated, many forms of psychology would be affected, physics unquestionably, even mathematics, certainly chemistry. All those disciplines would be affected by the lack of defense funding. There's no question about it. Implicit in your question is the civilian payoff. So you're kind of saying, okay, well, what's good about all these enterprises? Is that, no?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, I'm just thinking, because you're dealing with particularly coming off Jonathan's questions about the individual ethics of the particular scientist doing work.
Mm-hmm.
And then you explained how, there's all levels of people. Whether or not there's a societal payoff, spin-offs, or any of that stuff, I see it in students now where, they at one level recognize they have qualms about going to work for the DoD, but that's where the jobs are, that's where the pay is, and they seem to fairly happily make that devil's bargain with themselves, whether they're compartmentalizing, your trigger stories. So I'm just wondering if you'll deal with it. I mean, is that story part of the APAs or?
Oh, it has to be. It is. As a historical factor, it is a part of it. It's not, it's that devil's bargain that I'm trying to understand. What was that bargain? What happened? What exactly was involved in that bargain? And to say that science, technology, and medicine would be very different without this profound military interest is at least a neutral claim about whether it would be better or worse. And so we could just as a hypothesis raise the question of whether David Kaiser at MIT has done some wonderful, amazing research on the creation of physicists in the 50s and how many physicists were needed. And it was like, we need a certain number for defense. We have to have physicists in reserve at all times, okay? And there were all these ads that said basically, you don't have to be that smart to be a physicist. Be a physicist. Anyone can be a physicist. We need physicists for the Cold War, okay? So if you had to weigh creating that entire generation of physicists who were completely engaged with weapons research, would you want to say, that money was well spent? Or would you want to say, gee, there were other things that bright young people could have done besides build weapons? And that if we had a smaller physics community, but it was not totally obsessed with building weapons, that it wouldn't be doing interesting research? And I'm not even going to make that argument in the book. I mean, I'm not going to try to say, oh, it would have been better if things had been different. I'm just going to try to show in as much detail as I can what it meant that it was the way it was. And it had, and I believe it did have pathological consequences in many different ways. In terms of the knowledge produced, the impact of the career, what it has meant for science in general as a larger enterprise. Are we where we would in 2007? What is the nature of science? You know, what kind of an enterprise is science? How has defense spending shaped what this creature is today? And how different would it be if we knew different things, or if the funding structure had been different? And I can't, that's a counterfactual, you can't answer that in a historical analysis, but what you can do is to document some aspects of what it meant. And keep in mind that there are a lot of scholars, in fact there's just great stuff, which I'm going to use, a lot of scholars have dealt with money. So I've already written a chapter on, that's right now is just called Money. And I'm drawing on all those NSF reports and all the historical literature that's already looked at money, and I'm just documenting how much money are we talking about? How much money went to creating injury? And no moral judgment at all, just what are the numbers here? How much money is involved? And also there are a lot of people who've worked on these very specialized scientific domains that I'm interested in, like OR, meteorology, military psychology. There's a lot of literature on that stuff, and I'm just going to pull it in. I'm going to try to do kind of a synthetic study that says a lot of historians have been interested in these questions, trying to figure them out. I'm going to give them a certain sort of a scope and see where I can get. But I can't answer your question in a way. Your question is something like, what would it mean if it hadn't been this way? And I don't know. But it seems possible anyway that it would definitely be different if it hadn't been this way. So, well, you're my only questioners. We lost your class. Okay. Do we have any more? Okay.
The topic, but since you showed all those images,
Yeah.
you know that photography has played a very
Complex role, yeah.
war and public relations. Did any of those scientists or Beecher, did he use photography in his articles? Did they have images? Or were they just
Did they? Most of these images are drawn from military medical texts.
I see. Okay.
The other thing, I mean, for a while, as you can imagine, I got just obsessed with images of soldiers in litters. I've got 200 of these. I mean, I started thinking, well, how do they look? What are they doing? How are they carrying them? And this whole question. But photography, the visual image of the wounded soldier, and I kind of tried to hint at that at the picture from Iwo Jima. And then I'm sure you've seen, is it called Iwo Jima, the Clint Eastwood movie that's about the letters from Iwo Jima, that's about the photograph of raising the flag and how the photograph became the reality. And so I think photography, I mean, it's not my project, but I think an amazing work could be done on the photography of World War II. The images, because also, it's not, this is the litter people, these are medical texts. This is from the medical corps in various kinds of texts. But also, in the technical core, which is maybe 30 volumes, and every other page is a picture. And it's a picture of a pair of boots, or it's a picture of a truck, a truck facility, or it's just pictures of railroads, pictures of endless photographs of the technologies and the sort of technical details of running a global war.
Did they interpret those images? Do the text refer to the images or there?
They have a tagline that says trucks parked at Carlisle. I mean, you know, no, they're not interpreting. They're not interpreting the images. They're not. It's just as though they had all these. You know, the guy who took the Iwo Jima, he was a military photographer. They had photographers traveling with the front, with all of the troops. They were taking a lot of pictures of rescues, battlefield scenes, all kinds of things, and the pictures. It's a recognition that photography is a historical resource, that you take there are pictures of like packets of food. How did the packets look? Well, there's a little chapter and it says rations in 1943. And then they have 5 pictures of the rations that were available. I mean, it is just endless. It's like the statistics and the numbers. It's an incredible, and I think you could do a beautiful photography exhibit just on battlefield shots of World War II. Just, you know, the wounded, everything, all the things that were the uniforms, everything that people took pictures of. Someday, if you have extra time in the library, go look up Technical Services in World War II of the U.S. Army and look through those books, because they are amazing. And this is the use, and I don't know the history of photography very well. There may be someone who has done something explicitly about how photography became a military resource in this way. There's certainly stuff on photography and journalism, but I don't know if anyone's worked on military photographers. But it's clear that all these pictures are being taken. Most of them are so boring that they're being taken by military photographers, people hired to document. They're documentary photographs. So. No, go ahead.
Just to military people, or did these images?
Well, journalists could use any of the images that they wanted, but my guess is they didn't want pictures of the the ration boxes. But any image that seemed to have any news appeal would be released. The only thing I found is that later, it's funny, because many of the images of evacuating wounded soldiers appear in more than one source. Like there are certain images. There's one picture which I didn't show of someone delivering penicillin at D-Day. I think it must be a famous picture. I had never run across it, but he's kneeling and he's got an IV in a soldier, and sometimes that image appears with the face of the soldier visible. And somewhere around 1969 or maybe 65, they started airbrushing out the face of the soldier, like it was a violation of privacy. And then you can see it in like 1980, and the face is back. So there's some moment when the privacy of, and I have an entire book published, I think it's 62 actually, it's Coates in 62, where all the faces, not of the medics you can see, but the patients' faces are misty. They're sort of, they've grayed them out. And then you can see the same picture later and the face is visible. So there's some convention of photography or some point at which the medical corps becomes concerned about what happens to, the identification of the patient. But the practices of photography, the way photography was used, the propaganda value of photography in the war. There is that book, Roeder. Do you know that book? I think it's Roeder, and it's called The Propaganda War, and it is a history of, it's a slightly different question. It's a history of the pictures of horribly mutilated and injured soldiers that were censored during the war. So the military photographers took a lot of, and it's called The Censored War. That's it, The Censored War, and it's World War II. Might be Roeder is his name, and that they took any pictures that either journalists or the military photographers took that showed persons looking gross were not permitted. And also there's one sort of amazing picture of the disposition of bodies. Like, you don't show the way that they were throwing bodies away. You didn't want to show that during the war. And he kind of explores that. How were rules about censorship negotiated? But
one thing I wanted to add to that. So just following up on that.
Yeah.
What was interesting is the New England Journal of Medicine published a piece by Ethel Gowanda in December 2004, claiming better survival rates than any previous battle in the war in Iraq. Medical technology, and it was accompanied by all these very glamorous photographs and technology. So the use of these photographs and technology as a kind of propaganda continues.
Is old. Were any patients shown?
Yes.
But presumably with their permission, their faces were shown. Yeah, yeah.
Or maybe you just threw it too small, especially
You couldn't figure out who they were. Yeah. You can get permission now to show their faces, I'm assuming. And there have been a lot of stories about patient survivors from Iraq in the New York Times and stuff. So, yeah. But these images of technologies have a long-term propaganda value. Okay, thank you for your questions. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan. A wonderful talk.
Clapping for you guys.